He never wanted to be found. But she was already walking toward him.
The billionaire everyone recognized didn't recognize the man who saved her company. Can I sit with you?
Can I sit with you?
4 words that would unravel a secret he'd buried for 9 years.
9 years ago, a stranger's money kept her dream alive. She never learned his name.
She sat beside her secret angel and had no idea how close she was to the truth.
If you've ever wondered whether one quiet act of kindness can echo across a decade and come back to save the person who gave it, stay with me until the very end, because this story will remind you why some secrets are worth keeping and why the universe has a strange, beautiful way of returning what you give away. Before we start, if stories like this move you, hit like and subscribe to Real Feels. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories about single parents, sacrifice, and second chances. Daniel Hayes had exactly $41 in his checking account the morning his daughter, Lily, lost her first tooth. He remembered the number precisely because he'd checked it twice before deciding whether he could afford the $2 toy from the gas station down the street, the one shaped like a plastic dinosaur that Lily had been eyeing for weeks. He bought it. He always found a way to buy the small things, even when the big things, rent, the heating bill, the medical copay from Lily's asthma inhaler, sat unpaid on the kitchen counter in a stack he tried not to look at too closely. 9 years earlier, Daniel Hayes had been a different man. He'd held 3 biomedical patents by the time he was 29, the most valuable being a low-cost insulin delivery valve that hospitals in dozens of countries eventually adopted. The royalties had made him wealthy, not billionaire wealthy, but wealthy enough that money stopped being something he thought about. He'd been married then, to a woman named Claire who taught 2nd grade and laughed with her whole body and made him promise every single year on their anniversary that they would use whatever they had to help someone who needed it more than they did. It was Claire who found the small, struggling engineering startup buried in a local newspaper article, a 25-year-old graduate student named Victoria Sinclair who was trying to build an affordable prosthetic hand for children, working out of a rented garage with 3 unpaid interns and a landlord threatening eviction. Claire had shown Daniel the article over breakfast and said, "This is exactly who we promised to help." They wired the first donation anonymously through a shell foundation Daniel registered simply as the Maple Fund, named after the tree in their backyard. Victoria never learned who was behind it. Over the following 2 years, the Maple Fund quietly kept her company alive 4 separate times. Once when payroll would have bounced, once when a lab fire destroyed 6 months of prototypes, and twice when investors pulled out at the last minute. Each time, an anonymous wire arrived exactly when it was needed most, with a short note: "Keep building. The world needs what you're making." Victoria built a wall in her first real office with those notes pinned to it, never knowing the handwriting belonged to a man 3 miles away. Then Claire got sick. It happened fast, an aggressive cancer that took 11 months from diagnosis to funeral. 11 months during which Daniel spent nearly everything he had on treatments that ultimately couldn't save her, and gave away most of what remained to the causes Claire had cared about, because holding on to it without her felt unbearable. By the time she died, Lily was 2 years old, and Daniel was, for all practical purposes, broke. He sold the house. He sold the patents outright to a licensing company for a fraction of their long-term value, just to have cash in hand. He took a job as a maintenance groundskeeper for the city parks department, work that let him keep irregular hours so he could pick Lily up from daycare. Work that asked nothing of him except his hands and his time, both of which he had plenty of and nothing else to do with. He never told anyone about the Maple Fund, not because he was ashamed, but because Claire had always said the best kind of giving disappears completely, leaves no fingerprints, asks for no thanks. He kept that promise even after she was gone, even when keeping it cost him more than he could really afford. Victoria Sinclair, meanwhile, became exactly what that anonymous money had made possible. Her prosthetic hand company merged with a medical robotics firm, then went public, then became Sinclair Innovations, now valued at close to $4 billion, with offices on 3 continents, and Victoria's face on the cover of enough magazines that she'd, quote, stop counting. She was 34 now, unmarried, no children, a woman who had built an empire with her bare hands and lost, somewhere along the way, most of the people who'd known her before the money. Her younger brother Mark, who'd been the one to first suggest the prosthetic hand idea after his own childhood accident, had died of a heart condition 6 years earlier. The single loss that still visibly softened her whenever it came up, which was rarely, because she made sure it rarely came up. She was successful in every measurable way, and, by her own private admission to almost no one, desperately lonely, in a way that success had done nothing to fix. Victoria had recently moved her company's headquarters to Daniel's city, into a glass tower that overlooked the very park where Daniel raked leaves and repaired benches 5 days a week. She'd taken to eating her lunch on a walk through that park, alone, phone left in the office, because it was the only 20 minutes of her day that belonged entirely to her. She didn't know the groundskeeper's name. She'd noticed him only the way you notice any familiar background detail of a place you visit. Often, the man who always nodded once, never intruded, sometimes fixed the bench nearest the fire. So carefully it seemed like more than just a job to him. On the day this story turns, Victoria had just come from a board meeting that had gone badly. Investors were pushing her to sell a controlling stake to a private equity firm that would, she knew, gut the very research divisions, including the children's prosthetics lab, the one built on her brother's memory that had never been profitable but had always been the point. She walked into the park with her portfolio clutched to her chest like armor, sat down on a different bench than usual because hers was being repainted, and found herself, for reasons she couldn't fully explain even to herself, standing in front of the man raking leaves near the lake, asking a question she'd never asked a stranger in her life. "Can I sit with you?" Daniel looked up, startled. In 9 years of maintaining that park, no one from the glass tower had ever spoken to him beyond a passing, "Excuse me." He recognized her, of course. Everyone in the city recognized Victoria Sinclair, but there was something in her voice that didn't match the magazine covers. It sounded, oddly, like exhaustion wearing a very good coat. "It's a public bench," he said, which wasn't quite a yes, but wasn't a no either, and he shifted over to make room. She sat. For almost a full minute neither of them spoke, which should have been awkward and somehow wasn't. Then she said unprompted, staring at the lake, "Sorry. I just needed to sit somewhere nobody wanted anything from me." Daniel understood that feeling better than she could have guessed. "You picked a good bench for it," he said. "Nobody's asked me for anything in about 6 years. And even then it was just Lily wanting a juice box." "Lily?" "My daughter. She's 8 now." Something in the easy, unguarded way he said it, no performance, no angle, made Victoria look at him properly for the first time. Mid-30s maybe. Kind eyes with tired lines around them that suggested the tiredness was old and permanent, rather than a bad week. A gray Henley that had been washed so many times it had gone soft and thin at the collar. There was a quiet dignity to him that she couldn't place. The specific dignity of a person who had indeed once had a great deal and had learned to be entirely at peace with having very little. They talked for 20 minutes that first day, about nothing important, the kind of nothing that turns out later to have been everything. She learned his name was Daniel. He learned she took her coffee black because she'd luck. Once read it was more efficient, and had simply never stopped. Neither of them mentioned the board meeting or the maintenance schedule. When she stood to leave, she said, "I might come back tomorrow," and he said, "The bench isn't ties going anywhere." And something about the dryness of it made her laugh for what felt like the first time in weeks. She did come back, not just the next day, but most days after that, for nearly a month. Their conversations deepened slowly, the way trust does when neither person is performing for the other. Daniel told her, eventually, about Claire. Not everything, but enough. Victoria told him about Mark, about the accident that took his hand when he was 9, and the prosthetic that never fit right, about the promise she'd made at his hospital bedside to build something better for kids like him, though she left out the part about how she'd nearly lost that dream 4 separate times to money running out, and how each time it had been saved at the last possible hour by a stranger she never met. She didn't think of it often anymore. It had become, in her memory, less a specific set of events and more a kind of background gratitude, directed at no one in particular, because she had no one to direct it at. The trouble arrived, as trouble often does, wrapped in good news. Sinclair Innovations was profiled in a major business magazine, a long retrospective piece on Victoria's rise, and, because journalists dig, and because the Maple Fund's original filing, dissolved years ago, had left a paper trail, thinner than Daniel realized but not quite thin enough, a researcher working on the story found an old grant registry listing the Maple Fund as an early, repeated donor to Victoria's first company. A single sentence in a sidebar. Records show a now-defunct philanthropic entity, the Maple Fund, contributed critical early-stage funding on 4 occasions between 2015 and 2017. Its founder has never been publicly identified. Victoria read that sentence 4 times standing in her office, feeling something shift loose in her chest that she couldn't name. She hired a researcher of her own. It took him 2 weeks to trace the Maple Fund's original incorporation to a single individual, Daniel R. Hayes. It took her 1 more day to work up the courage to say his name out loud, sitting on the bench beside the man she now, without quite admitting it to herself, looked forward to seeing more than almost anything else in her week. "I need to ask you something," she said, and something in her tone made Daniel go very still, "and I need you to tell me the truth, because I think I already know it, and I need to hear you say it." He didn't ask what. He simply looked at the lake, the way he had that very first day, and said quietly, "Okay. Were you the Maple Fund?" The silence that followed lasted longer than either of them expected. Daniel had spent 9 years keeping this exact secret, honoring a promise to a woman who was no longer alive to release him from it, and now the moment had arrived without warning on a park bench, from the one person in the world he'd never imagined would ask. He could have lied. It would have been easy. He'd gotten good, over the years, at redirecting questions about his past. But looking at her, at the raw uncertainty on the face of a woman who commanded boardrooms without flinching, he found he didn't have it in him to lie to her. "Yes," he said. "It was me. And Claire. It was both of us, really. She found your story first." Victoria didn't cry, not at first. She sat with it, jaw tight, staring at the water, running the arithmetic of 9 years backward, every note pinned to her old office wall, every impossible rescue that arrived exactly on time, all of it traced back to the quiet man beside her, who repaired park benches for a living, and had never once, in a month of daily conversation, let it slip that he already knew everything about her rise before she'd told him a single word of it. "You let me talk to you about my company," she finally said, voice unsteady, "like I was telling you something new. You already knew all of it." "I wanted to know who you'd become," Daniel said. "Not who I helped you become. There's a difference. I never wanted credit, Victoria. Claire didn't want credit. That was the whole point. Why didn't you tell me, even after we started?" She gestured vaguely at the bench, at the month behind them, unable to name what it had become. "Even after this, because the second I told you, you'd have looked at me differently. You'd have started wondering if any of this," he mirrored her gesture, "was really about you, or about what I'd already put into you. I didn't want that. I still don't. I wanted you to sit on this bench because you wanted to, not because you owed the man on it anything." It was, Victoria would think much later, the single most honest thing anyone had said to her in a decade. But in the moment, it didn't land as comfort. It landed as a wound reopening, because it forced her to confront exactly how much of her adult life had been quietly held up by a debt she'd never known she owed, to a man who had given away his fortune, his health insurance, his financial stability, and asked for nothing, not even acknowledgement in return. The scale of it overwhelmed her. She stood up from the bench too fast, said she needed to think, and walked away without looking back, leaving Daniel alone with the lake and the old, familiar ache of having done the right thing and lost something for it anyway. She didn't come back the next day, or the day after that. Daniel told himself this was exactly what he'd feared, and exactly why he'd so long. That gratitude, once it curdles into obligation, poisons everything it touches. He went back to raking leaves, picking Lily up from school, reheating the same 6 dinners on rotation, and tried not to look at the empty bench each time he passed it. What he didn't know was that Victoria spent those missing days doing something she hadn't done in years, going through every note the Maple Fund had ever sent her, pulled from a storage box in her penthouse she hadn't opened since her old office closed. She read them in order. "Keep building. The world needs what you're making. Don't stop now. You're closer than you think. This one's harder to send, but you're worth it." That last note, she now understood, must have been sent not long after Claire's diagnosis, when Daniel and Claire had almost nothing left to give, and gave it anyway. Victoria sat on her apartment floor at midnight, and finally cried. Not from guilt, she realized, but from something closer to awe. And beneath the awe, a feeling she hadn't let herself feel toward another person in longer than she could remember. On the 5th day, she went back to the park. Daniel was at the lakeside bench, not raking, just sitting, staring at the water in a way that suggested he'd been doing more sitting than working lately. She sat down beside him without asking this time. I owe you an apology, she said. I made it about me, about what I didn't know, about feeling foolish for not seeing it. But it was never about me not seeing it. It was about you seeing something in a broke 25-year-old with a garage full of failed prototypes worth saving 4 separate times when you had every reason to walk away, and you did it without wanting a single thing back. I've spent 9 years being thanked by everyone for building this company. I never once got the chance to thank the person who actually made it possible. I want that chance now. Daniel's throat tightened in a way that surprised him. You don't owe me thanks, Victoria. Claire would say the debt was already settled the day you decided to keep building. Maybe, Victoria said. But I'm not asking because of a debt. I'm asking because somewhere in the last month, without meaning to, I started looking forward to this bench more than I look forward to anything in my calendar. And I don't want that to be about gratitude either. I want to know if there's a version of this where it's just about 2 people who like sitting next to each other. For the first time since Claire had died, Daniel let himself consider a future that wasn't just survival, wasn't just Lily's next school year or the next unpaid bill, but something built for its own sake, without an old promise attached to it. There's a version of that, he said slowly. But it comes with a package deal. 8 years old. Strong opinions about dinosaurs. Terrible taste in cartoons. I've been told I'm good with terms and conditions, Victoria said. And for the first time in the entire story, she smiled without any exhaustion behind it at all. What happened next unfolded slowly, the way real things tend to, rather than the way movies compress them. Victoria didn't rescue Daniel with her fortune, and he wouldn't have accepted it if she'd tried. Some pride, it turns out, survives even total financial ruin. Instead, she asked if he'd consider consulting for Sinclair Innovations' children's prosthetics lab, the one built in her brother's memory, the one the board wanted to cut. Not as charity, but because his old biomedical patents and his understanding of low-cost, high-impact design were exactly what that division needed. And no one on her payroll had his particular combination of expertise and humility. He said yes on the condition that Lily got to see the lab someday, because she'd been asking, ever since he mentioned the lady from the park, whether Miss Victoria built robot hands like in her favorite cartoon. Victoria said that could absolutely be arranged. 6 months later, the children's prosthetics lab wasn't to cut. It became the flagship division of Sinclair Innovations' new nonprofit arm, funded not by outside investors, but by a private foundation Victoria established herself, and quietly co-directed by Daniel, and named, over his mild protest and her firm insistence, the Maple Fund. Lily got her tour, and left with a small mechanical hand toy that could actually grip a pencil, and told her father on the drive home that Miss Victoria was the best kind of rich person, the kind who still remembers how to sit on a bench. Daniel Hayes never set out to be thanked. He set out once, a long time ago, to keep a promise to a woman he loved, to help a stranger he'd never meet, build something that mattered. He lost almost everything doing it, and in the process, without knowing it, planted the one seed that would eventually grow back into a life worth living. Not because Victoria owed him anything, but because kindness, given without conditions, has a strange gravity of its own. It doesn't always come back the way you expect. Sometimes it takes 9 years. Sometimes it comes back and sits down right next to you, asks if it can stay a while, and never really leaves. If this story moved you even a little, that's exactly why we make them, to remind you that no act of quiet sacrifice is ever truly wasted. Subscribe to Real Feels if you want more stories like Daniel and Victoria's. Hit like, so this reaches someone who needs the reminder today, and drop a comment telling me which line hit you hardest. We'll see you in the next one.